Under the flickering glow of failing emergency lights, she lay in silence, one hand pressed against the blood blooming from her side, the other gripping a weapon she no longer had the strength to raise. Everything in her training had led to this moment. Capture was not an option. Mercy was a myth. She was taught that if a human ever found her like this, wounded, defenseless, they wouldn't hesitate. There would be no question. No pause. No kindness. Only a shot to the head, a boot on the throat, and the cold indifference of a war that had long stopped making sense. So when she heard the hiss of the airlock open and the dull thud of magnetic boots approaching, she didn't hope. She didn't pray. She prepared to die. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and unhurried, echoing through the warped corridors of the dying warship. Shadows shifted across the walls, distorted by the flickering lights. Her vision blurred. Her breath grew shallow. And then he appeared. A silhouette in armor. Human. Tall. Armed. Alive. The enemy. She gritted her teeth and lifted the disruptor pistol with trembling fingers. The weight of it was suddenly unbearable. She tried to steady her hand, but her strength had already bled out onto the floor. His weapon was already drawn. Their eyes met hers, violet and raw with defiance, his hidden behind the reflective visor of a human exosuit. This was it. She braced for the shot. A quick, clean death. Maybe even honorable. She had fought hard. Killed many. Earned her place in the afterlife. But the shot never came. Instead, the human lowered his weapon. And for a moment, the war, the years of bloodshed, the indoctrination, the stories of monsters in human skin, they all cracked. He didn't move like a soldier. He moved like a man carrying something heavier than any rifle. Regret. He crouched, slowly, carefully, keeping one hand where she could see it. No sudden moves. No aggression. Just calm. Steady. Intentional. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softened by the helmet's modulation, but unmistakably sincere. She stared at him, stunned. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. This had to be a trick. A mind game. Psychological warfare. But then he reached for his belt, not for a blade, not for a restraint, but for a medkit. He pulled it free, set it between them, and opened it with practiced ease. Her heart pounded in disbelief. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "You're losing too much blood," he said, as he scanned her wound. "You won't survive another hour without help." Still, she said nothing. Couldn't. Her throat was tight with pain and confusion. The weapon in her hand dipped lower. He pulled out a coagulant injector, held it up for her to see, and hesitated. "I can save you," he said. "But you have to let me." She should have shot him. She knew that. But she didn't. Because in that moment, through the haze of blood loss and fear, she saw something no one had ever shown her before. Not dominance. Not pity. But choice. He didn't have to help her. He could have ended it. Walked away. Collected a reward. Let the war do what it did best, reduce everything to ash. But he chose to kneel beside her. To treat her not as an enemy. Not even as a prisoner. But as a person. With breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, she let the weapon slide from her hand. It clattered against the metal floor. The silence between them was louder than any battlefield. He pressed the injector to her side. The pain came fast and hard, like fire burning through her veins. She gasped, instinctively grabbing his arm. His suit was cold beneath her fingers, but his pulse was steady. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, unafraid. "I'm Cole," he said. She didn't reply at first. Her name felt foreign on her tongue. But eventually, she whispered it. "Lira." He nodded. A human gesture. Simple. Underrated. "Okay, Lira. Let's get you out of here." He slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her shoulders, and lifted her off the floor like she weighed nothing. The world tilted. Her head fell against his chest. And for the first time since the war began, she felt safe. No, not quite. But something like it? Maybe it was exhaustion. Or the sharp sting of truth piercing through years of hate. Or maybe, in that impossible moment, she had glimpsed the tiniest crack in the wall that separated them. He was human. She was Zelari. But pain, fear, and mercy, they didn't care about species. And as he carried her through the wreckage, weaving between the dead and the broken, she realized the war had taken everything from both of them. Yet somehow, here they were. Two soldiers. Two strangers. And for reasons neither could explain, neither wanted to be alone anymore. She expected the human to kill her. But he didn't. And nothing would ever be the same again. He hadn't meant to find her. In fact, Cole Maddox hadn't meant to find anything that day except scrap metal and maybe a few salvageable power cores. That's all he wanted now. Quiet jobs. Low-risk runs. No more allegiances, no more orders, and certainly no more blood on his hands. 8 years in the war had left him with more than just scars. It left silence in his bones, ghosts in his sleep, and the kind of weight that doesn't lift even after you've walked away. He'd been drifting from wreck to wreck, gathering pieces of other people's tragedies and selling them off to keep the lights on. It was easier than facing the real world. Easier than remembering. The war had taken everything. His squad. His rank. His faith in the cause. He wasn't a hero anymore if he ever had been. Just a man with a ship, a quiet voice in his ear named Myra, the AI who kept him company, and a deep ache that nothing could quite fill. Until her. Until Lira. She was never supposed to be part of the story. He found her curled in the ruins of a downed Zelari command cruiser. Bleeding, barely breathing, surrounded by twisted metal and a half-collapsed corridor. She was a warrior, clearly. Her uniform was scorched but intact, the insignia still shining faintly beneath layers of ash and grime. But it was her eyes that stayed with him. Even half-conscious, they were alert. Bright. Watching. Daring him to try anything. There was fire in her still. And that made her dangerous. He should have left. Every protocol, every instinct told him to. She was high-ranking, armed, and genetically enhanced. Her kind were known for their advanced neural warfare, for their psychic resistance and battle reflexes. Some said the Zelari didn't feel fear. Others said they just hid it better than humans ever could. But when he looked at her, not at the wounds, not at the uniform, but really looked at her, he saw something that surprised him. She was scared. And not just of him. Of something deeper. The kind of fear only survivors understand. He knew that look. He saw it every morning in the mirror. They were from opposite sides of a war that had shattered worlds. She was Zelari. He was human. But in that wreckage, they were just two people who had lost too much and lived too long. He carried her aboard his ship, unsure why he was doing it, unsure what it meant. Myra had warned him. even suggested sedation, containment. But he ignored it. Because somewhere in that moment, somewhere between the broken hull of her ship and the flicker of her fading breath, he felt something shift. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, for the first time in years, he wanted to save someone instead of bury them. She woke in his medbay 3 hours later, disoriented and defensive. The first thing she did was demand to know why he hadn't killed her. The second was try to stand, despite the pain. She didn't thank him. Didn't trust him. He didn't blame her. He didn't ask for gratitude. He just told her the truth. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He didn't want to be anyone's enemy. She didn't believe him. Not at first. Her every word was sharp, measured, careful. He'd expected it. The Zelari were raised in suspicion, trained to read between every breath and every blink. But as the hours passed, something subtle began to shift in her tone. She stopped assuming he was lying. She started asking questions. She wanted to know about his ship. About the war from his side. About the medals he'd stopped wearing, the scars he didn't explain. She asked like someone who had spent too long being told only one version of the story, and finally had the chance to hear another. In return, he asked about her people. Not out of curiosity. Out of respect. He didn't want to see her as a weapon anymore. He wanted to see her as a person. It wasn't easy. There were silences. Tensions. Old wounds that opened just by being near each other. But as they drifted through the stars, two fugitives on a ship too small to avoid the truth, they found something that neither of them expected. Common ground. Pain. Loss. Regret. But also hope, quiet and strange and tentative. Cole realized something one night as he sat across from her in the galley, watching her study the stars outside his window. They were both survivors. Not just of battles or near-death escapes. But of something worse. Of the kind of loneliness that eats you from the inside out. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. She was strong. Unapologetic. Brilliant in ways he could barely understand. But beneath all of that, she was still searching for a reason to believe again. So was he. They didn't call it friendship. Not yet. And certainly not anything more. But it was real. And in a universe built on fear, betrayal, and extinction-level politics, that kind of connection? That was rare. And maybe, just maybe, worth fighting for. Mercy was never part of the mission. It wasn't coded into battle protocols or etched into the briefings that soldiers like Cole Maddox were drilled to memorize. It didn't fit into the cold equations of war, where survival meant detachment and orders were designed to erase the luxury of hesitation. He knew what he should have done. He should have left her there on that broken warship, wounded and fading, a high-value enemy combatant who by all military logic posed a threat just by breathing. She would have done the same, he thought. Maybe even faster. And yet, when the moment came, when he knelt beside her and looked into eyes burning with equal parts defiance and despair, he didn't follow instinct. He didn't follow training. He followed something else. Something he thought he'd lost long ago. He didn't know exactly why he reached for the medkit instead of the sidearm. The decision didn't feel calculated. It didn't even feel rational. But there was something in her, something fragile buried deep beneath all that armor and venom that made him stop. Maybe it was the blood pooling beneath her. Or the way her body trembled despite her obvious effort to appear strong. Maybe it was the way she stared back at him, like she was daring him to do it, like she was already halfway gone and needed him to make the call. But what broke him wasn't her strength. It was the resignation. That quiet, devastating surrender in her eyes that said she didn't expect kindness. Had never been shown any. Not from his kind. Maybe not even from her own. And in that instant, he couldn't bear to be what she expected him to be. So he chose mercy. He injected the coagulant into her bloodstream, ignoring the pain in her expression and the way her hand reflexively reached for his wrist. She was too weak to stop him. Too proud to ask him not to. She didn't thank him. Not with words. But she didn't resist. And that was enough. Everything changed after that moment, not with fanfare, not with some sudden, cinematic revelation, but slowly, in quiet, human ways. He started watching her more closely. Not like a threat, but like a puzzle. A breathing, bleeding reminder that the enemy wasn't just some faceless monster on the other end of a plasma rifle. She had thoughts, fears, memories. Somewhere out there, she had a home. People she'd lost. People she might still mourn in the dark, when she thought he wasn't paying attention. And Lira? She changed too. Not all at once. The first few days aboard his ship were icy, clipped, full of suspicion and tightly guarded silences. She spoke only when necessary. She watched him like a hawk. Every movement, every glance, measured for intent. But slowly, the edges dulled. Her voice softened. She started asking questions, not just tactical ones, but human ones. Why did he leave the military? What did Earth look like before the bombings? Did he miss anyone? And for each question she asked, he had one of his own. What did her markings mean? Why did she flinch when the engines overloaded? Who taught her to read constellations like poetry? They didn't share a language of trust at first. But they started building one word by word, silence by silence, through broken stairs and meals eaten at opposite ends of the galley. Through shared headaches from oxygen recycling and disagreements over course adjustments. It wasn't easy. But mercy never is. Mercy is the long road. The slow climb. The conscious choice to see another as more than what the war branded them. And for Cole, that choice was beginning to feel like redemption. Not the kind that wiped away everything he'd done, he didn't believe in that, but the kind that let him carry the weight differently. More honestly. With purpose. Because each time she sat beside him without reaching for a weapon, he felt it. Each time she corrected his pronunciation of a Zelari word with a half smile instead of a cold glare, he felt it. Each time she allowed him close, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter, something that neither of them dared name, he felt it. He didn't just save her life. She started saving his. Piece by piece. Layer by layer. Not through grand gestures, but in the subtle rewiring of everything he'd once accepted as truth. Enemies don't cry in their sleep. They don't hum lullabies under their breath when they think no one's listening. They don't wince when the lights flicker because it reminds them of the moment everything exploded. But she did. And in those cracks, he saw her. Not the warrior. Not the alien. Just Lira. And slowly, painfully, beautifully she saw him too. Mercy didn't change the war. Not yet. But it changed them. And maybe, just maybe, that was how real revolutions always begin. Trust is not born in silence. It does not arrive gently, like light spilling across a floor. It does not settle easily between two people who have spent their lives being told the other is a monster. Trust, Real trust is carved slowly, painfully into the moments when you expect betrayal, but receive something else. Lira didn't trust him. Not on the first day, not on the second, and not even after he saved her life twice, once from bleeding out on the cold floor of a wrecked ship, and again when he shielded her from a scouting drone with nothing more than his body and a fading hope they wouldn't be seen. To her, Cole Maddox was still human. And humans were, if nothing else, consistent in their cruelty. They had reduced her cities to dust, vaporized her comrades in orbital strikes, and called it justice. They had studied her kind like specimens, probing biology with weapons instead of medicine. She had seen the worst of them. So when she opened her eyes in his ship and found herself alive, she did not feel gratitude. She felt fear wrapped in suspicion. Pain numbed by calculation. Every kindness he offered felt like bait. Every question, a trap. He didn't blame her. He recognized the look in her eyes. He'd worn it once himself, long ago, when trust had cost him everything. He didn't press. Didn't demand anything. He gave her space. He spoke carefully. Slowly. And when she said nothing, he learned to let silence stretch between them like a bridge not yet built. But little things began to shift. He noticed she stopped flinching when he entered the med bay. She began eating the food he prepared instead of pushing it aside untouched. She started adjusting the ship's settings, subtle things like recalibrating power flows or correcting his inefficient translation modules. Not for her survival. Not even to help him. But because a part of her couldn't ignore disorder, even aboard an enemy vessel. And in return, Cole let her into his space. Not just physically, though the ship was too small to avoid that, but emotionally, in ways he hadn't allowed in years. He told her about his brother, who died in the war. He showed her the broken dog tag he kept in a sealed box under the pilot's chair. He admitted things no soldier was supposed to admit. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't expect it. But she listened. And that was enough. One night, the ship's systems glitched, just a power surge, brief and harmless, but it sent the lights flickering and the gravity field into a stutter. She froze. Not like a warrior preparing for attack, but like a child remembering something she couldn't bear to relieve. Her breath hitched. Her eyes lost focus. And in that moment, Cole saw something rawer than rage. He didn't speak. He simply sat beside her, quietly, and handed her a cup of water. No questions. No pity. Later, she asked how he knew what to do. He told her the truth. Because that's what he'd needed once, when the nightmares had left him shaking in a trench with no one left to believe he was still human. That was the turning point, not some grand moment of sacrifice or rescue, but the slow realization that their pain was not so different. That maybe it didn't matter which planet they came from when the scars they carried looked the same under low light. Still, trust did not bloom. It cracked. It crept in like water through stone. She began sitting closer when they worked. He began waiting for her to speak before making assumptions. They disagreed. Often. Fiercely. She hated how inefficient his systems were. He mocked her obsession with perfection. But even in their tension, something softer existed. A quiet knowing. A shared fatigue. One night, as they reviewed star maps for a new course through an unregulated sector, she made a joke. Dry. Unexpected. In her own language. He didn't understand it at first, but the sound of her laughter, even faint, even short-lived, caught him off guard. He found himself laughing too, before even asking what it meant. And she didn't stop him. That was the first night he called her by her name without hesitation. The first night she didn't correct him. It was progress. Not a treaty. Not a vow. But something truer. They were learning to see each other not through the lens of war, but through the small, necessary rituals of survival. The way he handed her tools without being asked. The way she warned him of energy spikes before the ship's sensors even registered them. They moved through the stars not as allies, not yet as friends, but as two people who had begun to believe, just a little, that maybe they didn't have to be enemies forever. That maybe trust didn't have to be perfect. It just had to begin. And in that fragile beginning, something powerful stirred. Not peace. Not love. But possibility. And in a galaxy full of fire and wreckage, possibility was more rare and more valuable than any weapon they'd ever held. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor, inch by inch, until it darkened everything they thought they understood. Cole hadn't meant to uncover anything. He wasn't looking for secrets. All he wanted was distance from war, from politics, from pain. And Lira, though sharper in mind and spirit, shared that same exhaustion. She no longer cared who fired the first shot. She no longer cared who had been right. But the war wouldn't let them go. Even as fugitives drifting from forgotten outposts to unregistered moons, the conflict found its way back into their lives. Not through guns or soldiers, but through data. Raw, fragmented, corrupted, but buried in it was something that didn't make sense. And both of them could feel it. It started with a signal. A broken relay from an abandoned listening post orbiting a dead star. Cole only stopped because the post had power. Power meant tech. Tech meant salvage. But what they found wasn't salvage. It was a log. Encrypted and old, but human. When decoded, the log revealed an intercepted communication between a weapons contractor and a high-ranking Alliance officer. The message was brief, clinical, and sickening. Projected losses acceptable. Conflict extension beneficial. Schedule next Zelari strike to align with Helios deployment. Lira read it 3 times before looking at him. "You knew this name," she said quietly, pointing to the Helios logo. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Helios wasn't just a supplier. It was the supplier. The ghost company behind nearly every battlefield innovation in the last decade, on both sides of the war. She turned pale, her markings dimming like dying embers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was impossible. Unthinkable. And yet it explained too much. The battles that never made sense. The offensives that seemed designed to fail. The weapons that mysteriously fell into enemy hands days after being deployed. It had all felt wrong for years, but no one had dared to question it. Until now. They dug deeper. Every new system they passed through, every terminal they accessed, every junked military drone they hacked, it all led to more pieces. Shipment logs. Financial trails, communication patterns. At first, it was just a suspicion. Then a theory. And then a certainty. The war hadn't simply spiraled out of control. It had been managed. Fueled. Fed like a fire in a forge. Not for ideology. Not for vengeance. But for profit. Helios Corporation had been orchestrating key moments in the war from the beginning, selling weapons to the Alliance under one name, and then selling advanced countermeasures to the Zelari under another. They weren't just arming both sides. They were prolonging the conflict. Shaping it. Controlling it. Millions had died. Entire planets lost. For stock growth. Lira couldn't sleep after that. For days, she paced the corridors of the ship, muttering to herself in her native tongue. She blamed herself for not seeing it sooner, for believing the war had meaning, for being part of it. Cole didn't try to stop her grief. He carried his own. There were nights he sat alone in the cockpit, replaying the messages over and over, wondering which of his friends had died in battles choreographed from a boardroom. Wondering how many times he'd followed orders written not by commanders, but by shareholders. They had been weapons. Both of them. Blunt instruments in the hands of those who never stepped onto a battlefield. And now they were awake. The truth had weight. It pressed against their lungs. It burned in their bones. But with it came a question. What now? They were only two people. One ex-soldier and one enemy officer turned fugitive. They had no army. No resources. No allies. No one would believe them. Worse, those in power would want them silenced. And yet they couldn't unsee it. Couldn't pretend they didn't know. Because knowledge is responsibility. And the truth, once it takes root in the heart, demands action, even when the odds are impossible. Lira looked at him one night and said, "We can't fight this like soldiers." He nodded. "Then we don't fight it?" She raised an eyebrow. "We expose it." He didn't say it with fire. He said it with resolve. The kind that grows quietly, like something planted deep, finally pushing toward the light. They didn't know how yet. But they knew what had to be done. Because sometimes war doesn't end with a final battle. Sometimes it ends when someone, anyone, finally stands up and tells the truth. And they would. Even if it cost them everything. Because lies kill in silence. And they were done being silent. Running wasn't part of their plan. Neither was fighting. They had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that finding the truth would be enough. That exposing the lie would be a matter of gathering proof, transmitting it through the right channels, and letting the world see what they had uncovered. But the universe had never been that simple. Power doesn't surrender to truth. It resists it, buries it, hunts down anyone brave or foolish enough to speak it. Cole and Lira became fugitives overnight. The first warning came in the form of silence. Their transmissions went unanswered. Access to neutral networks suddenly blocked. The few contacts they thought might listen had either vanished or responded with clipped, encrypted messages that made their fear clear. Then the bounty appeared. Not just a trace order, but a full-spectrum alert from both the Alliance and the Zelari Dominion. 2 high-value targets. Armed. Dangerous. Subversive. Enemies of peace. That last part almost made Cole laugh. Peace had been dead long before they'd become its accidental defenders. From that moment on, nothing was safe. Not the mining station hidden behind the shadow of a dying star. Not the smuggler's route they had mapped through the Helix Expanse. Not even the backwater trading post where Lira had hoped to recover data from a forgotten diplomatic archive. Wherever they landed, pursuit followed. They stopped sleeping in the same place twice. They rotated ship IDs, adjusted heat signatures, masked their quantum drives. Lira used what she knew of Zelari sensor algorithms to throw their trackers off. Cole reprogrammed the Grey Line's comm array to emit ghost signals that mimicked old cargo haulers. But even with all their precautions, the enemy kept closing in. At first, it was drones. Silent and surgical. Machines without faces. Easy to shoot down, if you were fast. But then came the strike teams. Human. Zelari. Sometimes both. Professionals trained not just to capture, but to erase. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer warnings. They opened fire the moment boots hit the ground. And so, they fought. Not because they wanted to. Not out of pride or vengeance. But because survival demanded it. Because truth had become a target on their backs. Cole fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd spent years pretending he was done with violence. Every shot he fired was precise. Every move designed to end a threat quickly. Lira was more fluid, more controlled, her fighting style a combination of discipline and instinct, as if her body remembered things her mind was trying to forget. Together, they became something dangerous. Not because they were unstoppable, but because they refused to give in. Each battle left new scars. Each narrow escape cut deeper into the version of themselves they had once been. Their ship took damage they couldn't fully repair. Their bodies ached with exhaustion, adrenaline, and the quiet ache of knowing they were running out of time. But the worst part wasn't the fighting. It was who came for them next. People they had once trusted. Former allies. Ex-comrades. Soldiers they had trained with, bled beside, laughed with on distant outposts before the truth had opened a chasm between them. Cole recognized the pilot who led the ambush near the Pharos belt. He'd saved her life once on a moon that no longer existed. She hadn't hesitated to pull the trigger. Lira faced a Zelari warden who had once been her mentor. His face had not aged, but his eyes no longer carried doubt. When she begged him to listen, he called her a traitor and tried to cut her down. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a realization. The systems they had fought for didn't care about truth. They only cared about control. And when truth threatened that control, it didn't matter who carried it. Friend or foe, human or Zelari, those who stood in the way were marked for destruction. They learned to stop reaching for old loyalties. They had each other. That was it. And somehow, that became enough. In the quiet between firefights, they fixed the ship with whatever they had left. Shared rations. Took turns sleeping in the cockpit, always half awake. Spoke in whispers. Laughed, sometimes dry, weary laughter that sounded more like survival than joy. But even in that chaos, something else grew. Not comfort. Not safety. But trust hardened by fire. A kind of bond that doesn't need words. She would watch his back, even when she was wounded. He would cover her retreat, even when the odds were hopeless. And neither ever once suggested leaving the other behind. Because at some point, running stopped being about escape. It became about carrying the truth forward. Through wreckage. Through war. Through whatever hell waited beyond the next star. They weren't fighting just to survive anymore. They were fighting to give the truth a chance to live. The warning came without sound. Just a flashing red symbol on the ship's main console. A soft pulse. A quiet flicker. But in the vast silence of deep space, it felt like a scream. Cole was the first to notice it. A proximity alert. Something small. Something transmitting. At first, he assumed it was a sensor echo, a glitch. The gray line had seen its share of damage over the past few weeks. Every circuit board had been patched, rerouted, or coaxed back to life with little more than luck and stubbornness. But this wasn't a malfunction. The signal was real. And it was broadcasting their exact location. He called Lira to the cockpit, his voice tight and low. She arrived quickly, scanning the data with narrowed eyes. The signature was unmistakable. A Zelari military beacon. Secure. Encrypted. Hidden beneath layers of signal camouflage, but there, pulsing like a heartbeat. Neither of them spoke. Cole stood slowly, as if the wrong movement might set something off. "We're dark," he said. "Comms are off. Systems are shielded. This signal isn't ours." Lira's face shifted. Not confusion. Something colder. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her jaw tightened. "I've seen that frequency before," she said quietly. "It's not just Zelari. That's special operations tracking. Deep command level authorization." Cole stepped back, his hands suddenly heavy at his sides. "Are you saying someone tagged us?" She hesitated. Then nodded. "Yes." He stared at her. The silence stretched between them. "Are you saying you tagged us?" Her expression changed. Shock. Then anger. Then shame, buried deep behind a soldier's discipline. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned and walked toward the med bay, toward her armor. Cole followed, his footsteps slower, more deliberate. They pulled the panels apart together. No accusations. Just movement. Just hands working through muscle memory. And there it was, buried in the chest plate's lining. A node the size of a fingernail. Blending perfectly with the material. Designed to survive destruction. To outlive its host if necessary. A beacon. Lira stared at it as if it were a weapon pointed at her heart. "I didn't know," she said. "It's standard issue for officers. Deep field missions. Command told us they were deactivated unless manually triggered." Cole picked up the node with 2 fingers, holding it in the light. "Well, someone lied." Lira didn't respond. She didn't have to. The weight of it was written all over her face. He wanted to be angry. Part of him was. But not at her. Not truly. She had been used, just like he had. Another tool wrapped in orders and protocol and trust that never belonged to her in the first place. Still, the consequences were real. "If they've been tracking us," he said slowly, "they already know where we've been. Who we've spoken to. They could be using us to map out resistance cells. Safe houses. Evac routes." She closed her eyes. "I never wanted this. I know. But it's my fault." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for the scalpel from the emergency kit and placed it in her hand. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I assume that node connects to your bionet." She nodded. "Then we have to cut it out." She looked down at the blade. Her fingers trembled once, then went still. Without a word, she stepped onto the surgical platform and lay back. Cole activated the med scanner, calibrating it for Zelari anatomy. He found the relay point buried near the base of her ribcage, where skin met neural mesh. "This will hurt," he said. "I'm ready." But she wasn't. When the blade touched her skin, her body arched off the table. A low cry escaped her lips before she forced herself back into silence. Cole worked quickly, hands steady, heart thundering. The node came free, pulsing dimly in the sterile light. He dropped it into a containment field. Then he turned back to her. Her skin was pale, markings dimmed to a flickering blue. Sweat coated her forehead. Her breath came in shallow pulls. But her eyes found his. "You believe me now," she whispered. "I never didn't," he said. "But I had to be sure." She smiled. Faint. Pained. But real. I would never betray you, she said. I know, he replied. And for the first time, he truly meant it. Whatever distance had existed between them, fear, doubt, unspoken history, it had burned away in that moment. Not because everything was solved, but because they had chosen each other anyway. She reached for his hand. He took it. The signal was gone. The beacon destroyed. But in its place was something harder to build and infinitely more powerful. Trust, carved from betrayal. Forged in pain. Strengthened by choice. And it would hold. No matter what came next. Love didn't arrive like thunder. It didn't fall into their laps in the middle of some dramatic rescue, or explode out of adrenaline and desperation. There were no slow-motion glances, no whispered confessions beneath a blanket of stars. Love, for them, wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was earned. And it began in the space between fear and forgiveness. After the beacon was removed and the blood was cleaned away, Lira didn't speak for hours. She sat in silence on the floor of the med bay, legs folded beneath her, her hands wrapped in a piece of cloth stained from the procedure. Her markings were dim, almost invisible, and for a long time, Cole said nothing. He just sat across from her, repairing the sensor relay with steady hands that moved more from habit than focus. The ship felt colder than usual. More fragile. Maybe that's what happens when you realize how close you came to losing something you didn't yet understand you needed. They had been through too much together to call it nothing. And not enough yet to call it everything. They were somewhere in the middle, standing on a bridge they had built plank by plank through survival and scar tissue. It was never about romance in the traditional sense. There was no place for flowers or candlelight in the belly of a ship constantly on the run. There were no dates, no dinners, no easy labels. What they had was forged in the way they moved around each other. The way she passed him tools without asking. The way he recalibrated oxygen levels to suit her lungs when she was sleeping. They had learned one another slowly. Carefully. He memorized the rhythm of her footsteps, the slight lift in her voice when she asked about Earth. She learned the stories behind the objects he kept hidden in his quarters: a torn photograph, a faded journal, a pair of dog tags he never wore. It was the little things. Like how she stood at his side during every confrontation, even when she had the chance to run. Or how he patched her wounds without asking questions, even when he was bleeding himself. Trust had come first. Fragile, but real. Respect followed. And somewhere between coding data bursts and dodging kill teams, love began to take shape, not as a feeling, but as a decision. A choice they made again and again in the face of fear, in the weight of betrayal, in the silence of uncertainty. There was a night long after the first time she let her guard down, long after he stopped calling her Zelari and started calling her Lira, when the two of them stood beneath the observation dome, watching the gas clouds of the Perseus drift swirl in shades of orange and gold. He didn't mean to touch her hand. But he did. Just barely. And she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to him, her expression unreadable, her voice barely audible. "You know this can't last." "I know," he said. She nodded slowly, then looked back out into the stars. "I still want it," she whispered. "So do I." That was all. No kiss. No embrace. Just two people who had seen too much death and somehow still wanted to live. Together. Love didn't erase the war. It didn't make the fugitive status disappear or simplify the danger they faced. But it made the pain worth carrying. It gave weight to the risk. It turned every near-death moment into something more than survival. It turned it into a vow. Unspoken, perhaps. But no less real. There were other moments. Quiet ones. She would trace the veins in his arm when she thought he was asleep. He would rest his head near her shoulder when exhaustion took them both. They would fight, of course, about strategy, about trust, about what came next. But the fights were different now. They were safer. There was no more threat of walking away. Only the promise of coming back. He knew he loved her the day she took his hand before a drop onto a hostile moon and said, "If I fall, you keep going." And he told her, "Then you better stay on your feet." She knew she loved him when he carried her through a radiation storm, lungs burning, eyes bleeding, refusing to let her go even when she begged him to save himself. They were stubborn, wounded, uncertain. But they had chosen each other in the middle of a galaxy that had given them every reason not to. And love like that? That kind of love isn't found. It's built, earned, fought for. And once it's forged, it doesn't break. Not when the next battle comes. Not when the lights flicker and the hull creaks and the alarms scream. Because they no longer fight alone. They fight together. And that changes everything. The transmission didn't feel historic when it began. There were no grand speeches, no orchestral swell, no cheering crowds. Just the hum of old machinery, the distant flicker of approaching ships, and the soft static of a comms system on the verge of collapse. Cole stood at the edge of the comms platform, fingers clenched around a data crystal that had nearly cost him his life. Behind him, Lira moved with silent focus, her hands dancing over the console, integrating Zelari encryption with Alliance protocols. Her markings pulsed a steady blue, the rhythm of her concentration. There was no panic in her eyes. No fear. Only purpose. They had run for weeks to get here. Betrayed, haunted, wounded. They had slept in supply closets and crawled through rusted ventilation shafts. They had lost friends, blood, and safety. But they had not lost the truth. And now, finally, it was ready to be seen. The resistance station was barely holding together. Deep in contested space, it orbited a dead star forgotten by most NAV charts. The crew aboard it, ragtag defectors and idealists from both sides, had given them everything. One last chance. One last signal. If this failed, there would be no second attempt. Lira looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward and slid the crystal into the core slot. The console lights flickered, then stabilized. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. "Now broadcasting," the station AI confirmed. At that moment, something shifted, not outside, not in the galaxy, but in the room itself. The air felt heavier. Time slowed. And they both understood the weight of what they had done. Every military channel. Every civilian frequency. Every encrypted stream between the Dominion and the Alliance. All of it was now filled with images and audio files, intercepted orders, payment records, confidential briefings. Line after line of proof. Proof that the war had been orchestrated. That Helios Corporation, through shell companies and deep infiltration, had fueled both sides for nearly a decade. That soldiers had died to fulfill quarterly projections. That peace talks had been sabotaged to preserve revenue streams. The data left nothing to interpretation. It was undeniable. It was damning. Across 1,000 systems, across battlefields and bunkers and civilian homes, the war ground to a sudden halt, not from force, but from revelation. In the Zelari capital, admirals stopped mid-command, their screens flooded with unfiltered evidence of betrayal. On an Alliance dreadnought, a general stared in silence as his own signature appeared on a document authorizing a false flag operation. On colony worlds still smoldering from recent strikes, civilians fell to their knees, grieving not just their dead, but the reason for their deaths. Everything changed. Not instantly. Not easily. But irrevocably. Because when people are given the truth, they cannot go back to lies. Not truly. Not once they have seen the cost of their obedience. Lira stepped away from the console and leaned against the railing. Her shoulders trembled, just once. It wasn't relief. It wasn't pride. It was something closer to grief. "They'll come for us now," she said. "I know," Cole replied. But they didn't run. For the first time, they didn't need to. They had already done the one thing their enemies feared most. They had spoken. And in doing so, they had shifted the axis of history. Not with a weapon. Not with an army. But with courage. With truth. Across the comms feed, a voice rose. Not theirs. A minister from the Alliance government, her words heavy with disbelief and sorrow. She confirmed the documents. Acknowledged the failure. Promised hearings, investigations, change. A moment later, a Zelari dignitary followed. Her voice trembled. She offered apology. Then silence. Then a vow to dismantle the systems that had kept the war burning. Two voices, different species, speaking into the same silence. For the first time in years, they weren't shouting over one another. They were listening. Watching it unfold, Cole didn't feel triumph. He felt exhaustion. Like the kind that settles in the bones after a storm you weren't sure you'd survive. Beside him, Lira reached for his hand. Her grip was steady. Grounding. Neither of them said what they were thinking. That the broadcast had put a target on their backs. That the peace, if it came, might never reach them. That they might never be safe again. But it didn't matter. Because the truth was out. Because the war had cracked. And because somewhere out there, people were waking up. Choosing questions over loyalty. Choosing each other over orders. And in that single broadcast, in that quiet moment on a half-broken station orbiting a forgotten star, they had done something no fleet or strike force had managed in nearly a decade. They had stopped a war. With no medals. No parades. Just a signal. And the will to tell the truth when no one else dared. The first time they saw the new world, it didn't look like hope. It looked like dust. Like silence. Like ruins left behind by something too old to remember and too broken to repair. The planet, unnamed and unclaimed, sat on the far edge of habitable space, a place neither side had bothered to fight for during the war. It had no tactical value. No rich minerals. No ancient artifacts. Just atmosphere, gravity, and quiet. But that was enough. It was more than they'd had in months. The war hadn't ended cleanly. Truth rarely does that. The broadcast had torn a hole in the fabric of everything the Dominion and the Alliance had built, but tearing something down is never the same as building something new. In the wake of the transmission, the galaxy had fractured. Not with gunfire, but with questions. Some soldiers laid down arms. Others refused. Some systems declared neutrality. Others turned on their own leaders. Peace did not descend like a curtain. It came in pieces. In pauses. In the painful crawl of people choosing to stop long enough to listen. And through it all, Cole and Lira kept moving. They didn't want fame. They didn't want credit. The message had been their purpose, not their legacy. When others began to speak their names in reverent tones, they stepped away. Not out of shame. Not out of fear. But because they knew the work wasn't done. The galaxy didn't just need an end. It needed a beginning. So they found a world where no one was looking. A place untouched by strategy or history. And they landed. Not with an army. Not with a banner. Just two people who had lost too much and wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away again. The first shelters were simple. Fabricated from salvage. The air processors ran hot. The power grid flickered when the moons passed too close. But the soil accepted seeds. The wind carried no poison. And slowly, people came. Humans. Zelari. Others who had walked away from the war with nothing but scars and questions. Engineers. Farmers. Artists. Ex-soldiers who no longer wanted to carry weapons. Refugees who had grown tired of running. Survivors. Dreamers. Believers in something not yet built. They didn't call it a colony at first. They called it safe. They called it stillness. And eventually, they named it Oris, a word that meant dawn in both their languages. Cole helped design the fusion grid with a former Alliance mechanic and a Zelari biotech who used to build drones. Lira oversaw the first council, not as a leader, but as a translator between cultures, between fears, between the echoes of war that still lived inside everyone who arrived. There were days of tension. Of grief. Of old wounds reopened by small misunderstandings. A human child afraid of the markings on a Zelari's face. A Zelari farmer bristling at the sound of Earth standard commands. But each time something cracked, someone stepped in. Not with punishment. With patience. With memory. They reminded each other why they were here. Not to forget the past. But to survive it. Together. One evening, as the twin suns fell below the horizon, casting Oris in gold and violet, Cole and Lira stood on the edge of the settlement. Below them, lights flickered on solar panels storing the day's last energy. Laughter echoed faintly from a shared dining hall. Somewhere, a child sang a song neither of them recognized. Lira's markings shimmered in the fading light. She said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "I never thought I would live to see something like this." Cole didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand, held it gently. "I didn't think we were supposed to," he said. "But we did." They had built nothing perfect. But they had built something real. And in a galaxy that had fed on illusion for too long, that was more than enough. Oris grew slowly. It didn't try to be a model for anything. It didn't seek attention or declare itself a symbol. But word spread. Other ships followed. Other hands helped. And over time, what had begun with two fugitives became a sanctuary for hundreds. A place born not just of pain, but of what came after. Hope, not in speeches or promises, but in the soil. In the shared meals. In the quiet moments where fear gave way to trust. And in the center of it all, Cole and Lira stood side by side, not as heroes, not as soldiers, but as people who had chosen to love after war, to build after ruin, to live after almost losing everything. They had no guarantees. But they had each other. And for the first time in their lives, they had peace. Not the kind written into treaties. The kind you feel when the night is quiet. When no one is coming to kill you. when the stars are just stars again. And the future, at last, belongs to you. It began as a whisper. Two voices in the dark. A human and a Zelari. Strangers turned fugitives. Enemies turned something else. Their names were not carved into monuments, nor followed by ranks or titles. And yet, their message echoed farther than any fleet, louder than any weapon. Because it wasn't forged in policy or power. It was born from pain, and sharpened by love. The galaxy didn't know what to make of them at first. Cole Maddox, the ex-soldier who walked away from a war he once believed in. Lira, the decorated Zelari commander who risked execution to protect a truth that defied everything she was raised to defend. Together, they became an anomaly. Not because they fought against their own people, but because they refused to see people as enemies anymore. They stood on the ashes of their former lives and chose not vengeance, not silence, but truth. Not a truth wrapped in propaganda or twisted by fear, but something terrifying in its simplicity. That the war was manufactured. That the systems they had trusted had fed them lies. That peace had never been impossible, it had just been unprofitable. Their broadcast shattered everything. Not with violence, but with evidence. Not with fury, but with clarity. And once the message was seen, it could not be unseen. No one could go back to the old storylines of loyalty and conquest without feeling the weight of what had been lost for nothing. The galaxy shifted in that moment. But the message didn't end with the broadcast. It lived on in the lives that followed. In Oris, the settlement born from that revelation, humans and Zelari planted crops side by side. Children grew up learning both languages. Former soldiers shared meals with those they once would have killed. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes. But they were trying. And trying, after everything, was enough to make it sacred. Visitors came. Scholars, mediators, former combat engineers, even ex-generals who wanted to walk among the people they'd once only seen as numbers on a screen. Not to apologize. Not always. Sometimes, just to listen. Cole rarely spoke at those gatherings. Lira spoke less. But when they did, people listened. Not because of who they were, but because of what they had done. They had chosen to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. They had chosen compassion when hate would have been justified. They had chosen each other. And in doing so, they showed a divided galaxy what was possible. Not through speeches or declarations, but through their lives. Their message was never meant to be remembered in words alone. It was meant to be lived. Passed down. Not like doctrine, but like seed. Something that could take root in places neither of them would ever visit. Something that could grow in silence, without their names attached to it. Years later, when the first monument was built, it wasn't a statue. It was a garden. Set on the edge of Oris, overlooking the twin rivers that ran down into the valley. No plagues. No walls of honor. Just a simple inscription carved into the stone beneath a small arch. Let truth be spoken. Let love be chosen. Let peace be earned. That was all. But everyone who came understood what it meant. It meant that war didn't end with treaties. It ended when we chose to see each other clearly. When we decided that fear could no longer justify cruelty. When we let go of the myth that difference meant danger. It meant that peace would never be a gift from those in power. It would always be a fight. But not the kind fought with weapons. The kind fought in the heart. Every time someone chose to listen before judging. Every time someone reached across a line drawn in history. Every time someone said, I see you. I hear you. I will not harm you. That was the message Cole and Lira left behind. Not a legacy built on victory, but one built on survival. On forgiveness. On the radical, dangerous hope that tomorrow could be better if enough people were brave enough to build it. They never called themselves heroes. They didn't want to be remembered as symbols. But we remember them anyway. Because in the quiet, after the fires burned out and the banners fell, it was their story we held onto. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. And in the end, that's the only message worth remembering.